We are studying the life of David, and we are examining the manner in which David becomes a man after God's own heart. We're in Lesson 11, if you have the lesson sheets. Lesson 11, and I'll show it to you on the screen as well as we work through this. And we've tried to take a very practical approach to this. We've not tried not to get bogged down in just the historical discussion, because we need a little bit of that. We've got to understand kind of what's going on to be able to extract anything from it. But we try not to spend all of our time just talking about it from a historical perspective, but we're trying to also appreciate it from the idea of what can we learn from it. What kind of characteristic is David demonstrating, or what kind of characteristic is Saul demonstrating that would contrast what a man after God's own heart would be. So that's been our approach. And in Lesson 11, we're going to talk about the idea that just because an opportunity presents itself, should we always walk through that door? And the answer is no, right? Even though the opportunity might seem beneficial, and though the opportunity may seem like it's something that would bring some kind of benefit to me, we have to kind of also ask the question, will it strengthen me spiritually? Will it help the overall life picture that I'm striving for, and not just is it an immediate fix to some circumstance that's going on. Did Saul have much kindness towards David when this process begins? No, not. Once David's anointed, and it's known that he's ultimately going to be the one who becomes the king, there's not a lot of interest on Saul's part to be very kind to him. In fact, he's trying to what? He's trying to kill him, right? He's trying to pursue and find the moment that he can put David to death. And it's interesting because they actually cross paths, right? On various occasions, there are moments where they're in pretty close proximity to one another. In fact, there's a moment where they're in a what? In a cave, right? David's men are hiding out in the side. It's mind-boggling when you think about it. But they're hiding in the sides of the cave, and here comes in Saul and takes care of some business, for lack of a better description. And David could have easily taken his life, but he doesn't. He does take what? In that moment, right? Take people's clothing, right? And as if to say, Saul, you've been chasing me and trying to put me. This is how close I was to you. On another occasion, he and one of his servants are able to kind of get into the camp of Saul's army. And they get into the midst of it, and they're able to actually get so close that they take what? The spear and his what? And his water jug, right? They're able to get close enough to take Saul's personal spear and water jug, and they get kind of far enough away that David kind of shouts out to them, and they question initially, who is it that's talking to us? And then Saul recognizes his what? His voice, and realizes what had occurred. There have been occasions where David could have done far worse to Saul, but doesn't. And continually, what's the thought of David, even to his servants, why he doesn't do that? Because that's God's anointed, right? Over and over and over again. Well, I thought David was God's anointed. Saul was first. And though David has been anointed to ultimately become king, David never once, in some senses, considered in his mind that it was within his hands or his responsibility to force that to happen. Maybe Saul will die of natural causes. Maybe he'll die in battle somewhere. But Saul's not dying at my hands. And that's David's disposition pretty much for the whole thing. I'm not going to circumvent the plan of God. That's God's anointed until God decides otherwise. And David continually ignored these opportunities that he had over and over and over again to just kind of stop this whole madness. And you think about it, I mean, even David's servants are starting to get a little frustrated with this because they've seen these opportunities come and go. They're wondering in their minds, David, why haven't we just dealt with Saul, be done with this, and let's start leading the kingdom like we should? But that's not who David is. David sees a bigger picture than just the immediate circumstance in front of him. And sometimes in life, we have to see a bigger picture than just the immediate circumstance that's in front of us. And yes, there may be a quick response or a quick manner in which to deal with something that's presented itself to us. But is it going to help in the overall picture of what I'm striving to be as a child of God, as a follower and believer in Jesus Christ? And those are the kinds of questions that we have to ask. And that's kind of what we'll talk about, Lord willing, tonight as we progress through our study. I'm listening. Go ahead.
Right.
I'm listening. Go ahead.
In that cave incident, David even cut off a piece of
Yeah.
Saul's robe, and he regretted that.
Yeah. Even something as small as that it bothered him later that he would have even gone that far. And again, that's speaking volumes about the character of who David is and what he's about.
If David had killed Saul, that would have maybe changed the whole pattern that God had planned.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. He begins in his own mind, at least, and I suppose that in the plans of God too, he circumvents the full purposes of what God wants to fulfill. Even though the opportunity was there, he recognized that wasn't the course. Let's jump to these questions as have been our pattern in this study and start examining them. And I'll show it to you on the screen here momentarily. And we can kind of work through these historical backdrops and pull and extract the practical lessons from each one. So I want to start in 1 Samuel chapter 23. 1 Samuel chapter 23, and we're going to look towards the latter end of the chapter. I believe in verse 24 is where we want to begin in this moment. They arose and went to Ziph before Saul, but David and his men were in the wilderness of Mason, in the plain of the south of Jeshimon. Saul also and his men went to seek him. They told David, wherefore he came down into a rock and abode in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. And Saul went on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain. And David made haste to get away for fear of Saul, for Saul and his men compassed David and his men round about to take them. Now, let me stop you for just a half a second and think about this for a moment. So David's mindset through all this is, I don't want to do what to Saul? I don't want to kill him, right? I don't want it to happen at my hands. Let God's plans be fulfilled. Whatever God intends, let it be. If it's natural, it's natural. If it's battle, it's battle. But David also, and I think about this fear, and I suppose in one side, you just have the natural fear that Saul's pursuing me, and if he can get his hands on me, he means harm. But there's also the fear that if the two bodies or the two armies meet, they're going to what? They're going to fight. Now I'm going, if the two armies are put into the same proximity to each other where they can see each other, they're going to fight. And if they begin to fight, that means David now is left with a decision of, do I fight with my men? Or do I stick to these principles that I don't want to be responsible for the death of Saul? And so rather than do that, when he figures out where Saul is, he just does what? Yeah. And he stays on one other side. You know, you ever thought about that? You think you maybe have walked some of these hills sometimes and never even gave a thought to somebody that might not be all that far from you. But they're just on the other side of the hill. And you may have walked parallel to each other without not a lot of distance in physical distance between you, but because you were out of sight and no idea. And so here they go, walking on each side of the mountain. And there came a messenger, verse 27, unto Saul, saying, Haste thee and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. And wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. Therefore they called the place that. And David went up from thence and dwelt in strongholds at En-gedi. And so you have this scene. And here's this loyal servant of Saul, and yet Saul's still pursuing to put him to death. And the question really is then, why hadn't David responded? And reacted to Saul's challenges in the same way that he did Goliath's?
He was God's anointed.
Okay, Saul's God's anointed. Goliath was it was the enemy, right? He's the uncircumcised Philistine, is the way he's described. And so there's a difference in those two pictures. the fear, and that's why I want to get back to that idea of the fear in this text. I don't think we can say David is afraid of Saul in the sense that we might think. He certainly wasn't afraid of who? Goliath. He's not afraid to fight. Right? He's not afraid to fight. So his fear seems to be slightly different than that. It seems to be his fear is, if I get into conflict, then I may have to breach the very character that I've adopted and the position, if you will, that I've adopted in relationship to how I handle Saul. I could be wrong about that, but that's just something that I thought about as I was looking through that. Go ahead, Bob. I saw you.
The stronghold that it mentions here doesn't mention any name, so I'm assuming that it's not a man-made fortress. That it's maybe like a natural fortress. They call it a stronghold or caves or something.
Yeah. I didn't pursue any of those. You know what I mean? I didn't really look to see any of those details. Yeah, I'd have to look, but I don't know off the top of my head. Any other questions, thoughts? Go ahead, Roger.
In my studies, Saul wasn't exactly one of the bravest leaders of the fighters of the army.
Well, obviously, he sat back and let Goliath run roughshod over him for a while.
Yes, but I think it was another one or two when there was battles, and he stayed back. I bet the other people did the fighting. So I don't think David feared him.
Yeah, not in the sense that we generally might think.
I think it goes back to something you said earlier. It wasn't so much he was afraid of Saul as he was, and it would affect his character, but to me, what jumps out at me, or what at least seems to, is he's more afraid of, not necessarily even afraid, but fearful in the concept of respect and reverence, that this is God's anointed, and I'm afraid of offending God. I'm not going to offend God in my action, and there's a lesson in that for us today. If we take an action against another individual, and it's not, how do I want to put it? It's not with a godly character. How does God look upon our treatment of others?
If you put this back into the theme that this lesson's about, the idea of opportunity, but do I advantage every opportunity that comes? I think there's a sense from David that how many of these opportunities are going to come and go, and I'm able to resist this temptation of not dealing with Saul in the manner he's been dealing with me. And maybe that's the lesson for us from the practical side of this, is sometimes it's better to be on the other side of the mountain than to walk right on the edge where the temptation is, and put myself into the circumstance where maybe it's an opportune moment to take advantage of that, and I start making choices and decisions that I've been trying to avoid. And I put myself in situations that I've been trying to avoid.
It's almost like a retaliation mindset.
Yeah.
And David said, I'm not going to retaliate.
Yeah. And so David recognizes that the more opportunities he has to maybe reach out and put his hands on Saul, the harder it's going to be to avoid that. The harder it's going to be to keep his servants and the men with him restrained. I mean, there's a bigger picture here. And so for us, sometimes we need to get on the other side of the mountain and stay over there and not put ourselves in these opportunities to make choices and decisions that might threaten our spiritual character. Go ahead, Jim. I'll come back, man.
Is it possible David's thinking, well, God will take care of this in his own time?
Yeah, well, certainly I think that that's been his mindset. I think we'll even see that in one of these texts if we get to it tonight. But where he even says that I'm going to let the Lord's purposes play out, whatever they may be. And David's committed to that.
You have to wonder, Brian, what drives a man to go to these great lengths to kill another man. And it goes back to the two words we studied before of him being jealous. I looked up that word in because it struck me as being a little more than me. It says, the malignant passion which sees in another qualities which it covets, and hates or possesses, ill will, malice, spite. And the last comment they made was one of the most odious and detestable of vices.
Yeah.
That with jealousy is what's driving Saul.
Yeah, and we back to that earlier lesson. When you combine those traits, it motivates some pretty bad decision making, and that's what's happening on Saul's side. And on David's side of this equation, the man after God's own heart, he's doing everything he can to just avoid putting himself in those situations. And there's a lesson there, I think, of value.
You know, one thing about Jeff's question, the second part of number one,
Mm-hmm.
why didn't David respond the same way as he responded to the challenge of life?
Yeah.
Saul did not curse and swear the Israelites, or Goliath did.
Yeah.
David had something personal that he felt that he shamed the Israelite people. He mocked their God.
Right.
And Saul hadn't done that.
Yeah, David's able to discern the differences in these circumstances and make wise decisions based on that. Jump to question 2. And on what basis might David have been otherwise justified in seizing any opportunity to kill Saul? And he just referenced a couple of texts that we actually had already looked at in other moments. Go back to chapter 16 and verse 12, I believe is where we want to be. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with all of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. And then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. I think the part of this we forget is we almost think, well, David's not king yet. Well, he's been anointed to be such already when all of these events are occurring, and that is becoming more and more known, and it's obviously known in the eyes of Saul. And so when you think about that, David could just be simply thinking, you know what? God has already picked me to be king anyway. And so what would be wrong to just simply hasten that? And God's already decided it. It's not really my decision. You can see the rationale. It's not really my choice. I might be hastening it a little, or I may be taking matters in my own hands a little here, but it's really what God wanted anyway. And you can kind of hear the logic someone might use in that circumstance. Especially when it comes to spiritual matters, personal spiritual matters, be cautious when you or I find ourselves rationalizing our way into a decision. Because sometimes if it takes that much rationalization and that much kind of process to kind of, in a sense, talk myself into doing something, I may want to step back and take another look at that. If I start using kind of the rationale that so often we do, we can sometimes make some pretty poor decisions. David could have very easily rationalized this whole thing and said, I've already been chosen to be the king anyway. Let's just get it over with. But that wasn't who he was. He didn't rationalize the circumstances to the point where he was going to compromise his character in order to fulfill some purpose. That's kind of the mindset you and I have to have. As we think about our decisions and choices, don't rationalize something to the point where now we're actually willing to sacrifice or compromise our character and who we're supposed to be as children of God to be able to do this or that, or make some decision that we're looking to. What happened in the other text? Chapter 22, verse 11.
Saul ordered the death of the priests of God.
Yeah. I wanted to look at this. Thought about this a little bit this afternoon, even as I was restudying some of these things. But the king sent to call Ahimelech, priest, the son of Ahitub, and I'm making all that up, by the way. You can say those names however you want. And all his father's house, the priests that were in Nob, and they came all of them to the king. And Saul said, Hear now, thou son of Ahitub. And he answered, Hear my lord. And Saul said unto him, Why have ye conspired against me, thou and the son of Jesse, who is David, right? In that thou hast given him bread and a sword, and hast inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait, as at this day. Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, And who is so faithful among all thy servants as David? Why wouldn't I what? Why wouldn't I help David? That's what he said. Why wouldn't I help? Who's a greater servant to you, Saul, than David? Who among you is more worthy? He's your what? He's your son-in-law. The priest basically says, you've got me in a pickle here. If I don't help him, I'm refusing help to your greatest servant, who is also your son-in-law. If I help him, you're mad at me because you hate him. There's no win for him here. He's always doing your bidding. He's been honorable in your house. It's amazing how good David was to Saul, despite Saul's character. Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Be it far from me, let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to all the house of my father. For thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. No one knew what you're talking. The king said, Thou shalt surely die, Amalek, thou and all thy father's house. And the king said unto the footmen that stood about him, Turn and slay the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he had fled, and he did not show it to me. But the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, Turn thou and fall upon the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned, and he fell upon the priests, and slew on that day 85 persons, 85 people, that did wear a linen ephod. That's how despicable Saul had become. His anger and hatred towards David was so fierce that if he even had an inkling that somebody had assisted or aided David, or even refused to tell Saul where David had went, his 85 people killed. His own servants realized this is not right, because they're what? I'm not doing that, buddy. You'll always find an evil person if you need one to do evil things. And Saul turns to Doeg, and he accomplishes that which Saul commanded. Here's the point, though. David could have rationalized, I've already been anointed the king. I'm just going to deal with Saul. David could have rationalized, look how evil Saul has become. He slew 85 priests for nothing. For nothing. Except that he's evil. And would anybody have questioned David, by the way? Nobody would have questioned him. To my knowledge, nobody would have questioned what he had done if he had slain Saul. But David's character is more important to him than that. And though all the rationale and all the logic and all the reasoning and all the things that you could pile up and say it would be perfectly justified. And I guarantee, well, I shouldn't guarantee how you think, but I'm pretty sure that I could walk around this room tonight, and if I put that scenario before you, most everybody in this room would say David should have dealt with him a long time ago. But that's not the character of David, and he's not willing to compromise that. And that's the disposition. Just because opportunity is there, just because we can rationalize it through what we believe is logical thought processes, doesn't excuse abandoning who we should be just in order to accomplish that.
Do you get the impression from reading this here about the priests and character that most of the Israelites did not know of the conflict between Saul and David?
That's the impression I got here. That their knowledge of what had been happening between the king and his son-in-law, that's his imagery, right? He's just talking about the king and his son-in-law. That's your best servant. I never thought about any of these other things you're talking about, that you were pursuing him. Yeah, I think there's a sense that they're saying, we were in the dark here, and still didn't appease him or change his thinking about it. I'll come back, Roger. You're okay, Randy. Go ahead.
When his own soldiers wouldn't turn and obey his word, that should tell you something of how they felt about the situation. They knew he was wrong. Yeah. They knew this shouldn't be happening, and they wouldn't do it.
Yeah. Go ahead, Roger.
You just made a statement a little bit ago, and I think it's absolutely correct. We look at it the way we would handle it. We're not looking at it like God had handled it. Yes, he had anointed David, but he had not yet taken that kingdom away from Saul.
Yeah.
But we're not understanding that part of it.
And the practical side of that is when opportunities present themselves, there needs to be a willingness on our part as children of God to view that circumstance through the eyes of our Creator, not just through our human eyes or through our human perspective, but to actually stop and consider how would God view this moment. And that to me is probably the only thing keeping David from doing back to Saul what Saul has been lashing out to him.
David to take Saul's life so he could have the kingdom.
Yeah.
So I guess David remembers all that.
Right.
You read that verse 19, not only did he kill the priest, but he slaughtered the entire city.
Yeah. He took them all out. Yeah. It's a pretty sad piece of history. And it might even go as far as in our minds justifying anything David would ever do to Saul. But even when we see what we think are just things that just reach beyond the pale, we still have to maintain the character that God would want us to, even those moments. And I think that all of us, I do that every time. All of us need to keep that in mind. Question 3. How did David prove himself then? More righteous than Saul in the cave in the wilderness of En Gedi. Okay. Let's look just at portions of this. I don't want to read the whole text, but let's. Saul's coming back from following the Philistines. Remember, they both sides of the mountain, right? But what happened before they come out the other side? Yeah, Saul's called away, right? Saul gets word the Philistines are hitting hard back home. You need to get back. And so Saul leaves, takes his army, and goes back. And then when Saul has now returned from chasing the Philistines down, he's told that David's in the wilderness of En Gedi. And Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of Israel. He's not leaving anything to what? Chance here, right? I'm taking 3,000 of the best. Not just give me 3,000 guys and let's go. 3,000 of the chosen men out of all of Israel. And they seek after David. And he came to the sheepcotes by the way, and there was a cave. Saul went in to cover his feet, and David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. And the men of David said unto him, Behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, Behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. And it came to pass afterward that David's heart smote him, because he had cut off Saul's skirt. I want to stop and consider something with you for a moment. The men that were with David, verse 4, say to him, Behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, Let's come. We're here. Sometimes the opportunities present themselves and we've got an audience cheering us on. What do I do in that moment? When it's an opportunity that's presented itself, but it's got some issues, and in my heart says I should just walk away from this. And David's spiritual heart is telling him, get away from this. But he's got an audience telling him what? Now's the time. Now's the time. Now's the time. Now's the time. Behold, the Lord said. Well, yes. Fast forward into the New Testament for a few minutes. Jesus fasted for 40 days and 40 nights right after his baptism of John. Satan appears to him. And what does Satan use to try to get Jesus to make certain choices? Yeah, use Scriptures. Well, even the Lord said if you call upon angels, they'll come down and sweep you right up if you cast yourself off this high place. Jesus has the audience of Satan telling him Scripture. But obviously, Jesus was wise enough to know that Satan was not using those thoughts and those passages and that the principles that were at hand in the manner in which God intended. The men of David are saying, the Lord told you that ultimately this is going to happen. This is it. Sometimes even people can use what appears to be a spiritual mindset. But the truth is that may not be exactly what God intended in that moment, or that may not have been what the context of thought that was being shared within a certain passage may have had in mind. And we may have to stop and consider whether that Bible verse really applies to this circumstance or not. And that's not always easy, right? I mean, it's hard enough to fight and resist these temptations and fight off these opportunities that come and go. But now I've got to resist the idea that I might even be being told Scripture that might be leading me in a certain way. What I love about David is he in some ways, there's a human element to him. He gives in a little, right? That's what I see here. The pressure of the man and the enticement he gives in a little, and he cuts off the skirt of Saul's robe. In a sense, of course, I guess it's hard to know what his exact motives are, but here's this imagery. But the character of David is so strong that made him even feel bad. That he would even do that. Opportunity presents, but is it really the right choice? Is it really the right decision? And be careful. The audience around us and the people that are around us may be giving us all kinds of thoughts to consider, and they may be pushing us into certain choices and decisions, and they may be even using biblical logic in their minds. But is it really the right answer in the midst of the challenge? And that's where we have to come. I'll come back on.
Right. When the men, David's men, said this is the time that the Lord has delivered your enemy.
Yeah.
I have not found any place where the men can get this information unless it's not recorded.
Yeah.
But in chapter 20, it does mention about God cutting off all of David's enemies.
Yeah, and again, I think I think they're just trying to encourage David by whatever kind of even somewhat manipulated thoughts to get him to deal with Saul. Even though they may not have had a direct statement from God of this kind of magnitude, they may very well be turning things that are said about what would eventually happen to Saul and advantaging it because they're tired of this process. I'm sure as well. Go ahead, Al. I'm sorry. I saw your hand a little bit ago. My bad. You sure? No, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah.
David had expressed that. I think he had written Psalms at this point.
Right. Any other thoughts up to here? So we can see this imagery then. And his men are frustrated. And they're leading David towards different kinds of decisions. But the opportunity didn't mean David should avail himself of it.
They think you ought to end it right now.
Yeah.
Not prolong it anymore.
Yeah. And so with that mindset now of what we're driving at, the question was, and by the way, and I hope you caught on to this, he said, list 3 occasions, not 3 occasions necessarily you would find in Galatians 5:13 or Hebrews 11:15. Those are the backdrop to help you. But he's asking generically, list 3 occasions when it would be better not to answer when opportunity knocks. And you say, how do I know he meant that when he wrote? Because I have his answers. And they weren't part of those narratives. I mean, they're the backdrop. They're not the specific. So he was allowing you to think on your own. So what kind of occasions?
Better job somewhere where there's no congregation.
Okay, so let's think about that a little bit. And we can throw, there can be all kinds of things that you can throw into this. School, job, career, although those are somewhat similar. All kinds of things. Now, we need to be willing to consider. Now, you might conclude that, it's going to be hard, and it may mean having to drive it out. I know guys that drive an hour and a half one way, sometimes 2 hours one way. so they can go and worship. And they're committed to that, and they fulfill that. And so I'm not trying to imply that I've got some kind of magic formula or some kind of great knowledge that gets to decide for people. But it should be considered, right? Before we take on head to some college somewhere, or before we take on some career or job, before we get involved in any of those kinds of things, then we ought to stop. How is that going to affect my spiritual well-being? It may be a great opportunity. It may be something that's going to provide in better ways for my family, and I may be able to do it and have no issues whatsoever. The point simply is, don't just accept an opportunity and then try to figure out what it may or may not do to my spiritual well-being. Ask yourself the question first. Before I take that opportunity, before I walk into that circumstance, resolve some of those issues and make sure I've got a path and an answer to how that's going to affect me spiritually before I can make it. Because there's not a job, a career, or a promotion, or any kind of personal advancement that is more important than our spiritual well-being. At the end of every thought should always be, is this ultimately going to hinder or help my spiritual well-being? Or at bare minimum, is it neutral in relationship to my spiritual well-being? But if I can see ways how that might hurt, then we may want to step back from that. And I could anecdotally show and share with you all kinds of individuals I've known who've made tremendous sacrifices because they knew if they took advantage of the opportunities in front of them, it was going to put them at a spiritual disadvantage, and they simply were not willing to make that sacrifice. David's not willing to sacrifice who he is as a man after God's own heart simply because opportunities are presenting themselves.
There are people who just want to cause trouble. They don't care about the truth. They'll get you all stirred up. And sometimes it's better to walk away.
Yeah. And certainly David's been trying to do that. Let's go look at these texts and maybe help us a little bit think about this. But Galatians 5:13, for brethren, ye have been called unto liberty. Only use not, or that's an italics word, which simply means it's interjected to help kind of give meaning. But I think here the idea is only not liberty for an occasion to the flesh. In other words, yeah, we've been set free from sin. We've been given certain liberties. We're not bound to that Old Testament law anymore. But don't conclude that somehow that liberty sets you free to do anything that you want to do. You still have to be cautious and recognize the sins of the flesh and the things that can challenge us. And that's kind of the added thought to this process. What other occasions? We wrote down job and career and those kinds of things. Did you think of anything else?
How about choosing a mate?
I think that's crucial, Gary. This isn't. I think sometimes we boil that down, and what we hear when we hear that is marry a Church of Christ person. And I try my very best not to say it that way, because that's not necessarily the right way to say that. It's not true, number one. But certainly you want to be cautious about becoming one flesh when you know that very well is going to be a challenge to your spiritual well-being. And I can't stress that enough, because of what the Bible says marriage is. It's two people becoming one. And it's awful hard. Not impossible. There are biblical examples where they tell folks that are in marriages to strive to be honorable and live up to that relationship. But let's not also put the blinders on and fail to recognize that that's a decision and a choice that really needs to be thought soberly when it comes to our spiritual well-being. And certainly a great word of caution there.
Could be, we want to think of it as one that has positive moral attributes and honors God and Christ. wealth, and you see those,
Yeah.
that in their life, and that person, whether they're a member of the church or not.
Right. And those things can come. And the quality of character, and sometimes is more important than a log where we're checking off things. And we have to be careful about that. But I think just from a generic standpoint, just like choices of career and locations and spouse, all these things can have effect. What else maybe you wrote down?
Or sometimes getting evil, or getting even with others.
Okay.
And it belongs to the Lord.
All right. So there are going to be opportunities sometimes. Let me write this way. It's probably more of a word we would think of. When we have an opportunity to get revenge on somebody, just like David. No, we may not be being pursued by the king of the Israelites, but we may be in circumstances where somebody has been a thorn in our side for a long time, and opportunity is present to be able to seek a little revenge on that circumstance. And you know, those opportunities sometimes can present themselves, and we've got to ask ourselves, am I gonna take advantage of that? Am I gonna kind of seek my own personal vindication in those circumstances, or am I gonna be a little more like David, the man after God's own heart, and be cautious about seeking personal revenge? Anything else you may have written down?
This choosing spouse, choosing friends.
Yeah, that's a good point, because that can have just as a dramatic effect and shapes us more than we realize sometimes. And I think that we have to be careful that our desire and the opportunities that present themselves, and I guess maybe sometimes, Judy, with that we could say, here's this opportunity for friendship in some circle, and then I begin to think, well, what am I going to have to compromise in order to be in that circle? And what kinds of choices am I going to have to make till I fit in to that grouping? And sometimes it's a willingness to compromise the character of God in order to fit a certain style, so that I can be part of that friendship group. And so that's hard sometimes. Question 5 then asks, after this, Samuel died. Okay, he's been... it's kind of... We've read through so much of this narrative. Who is he, by the way? Just not to insult your... He's the what? Yeah, and kind of he was back at the beginning of this, right? It was his... Was it not his sons that the people didn't like? And when you're gone, we need something better. So we want a king like everybody else has a king. Well, what they feared has finally come. But the real challenge at Samuel's death is not that his sons got to take over. The real challenge at Samuel's death is you've lost the one who's been mediating these matters and trying to resolve some of the conflict here. So Samuel's now died. Saul's back to his old self. How did David again prove his loyalty and harmlessness in chapter 26?
When he went to Saul's camp and he could have killed him again.
Okay. So, in the water. So this is the one we referenced at the beginning of our study in chapter 26, where they get close enough and David takes a servant with him, and they're able to get close enough to Saul to take his spear and his water jug, for lack of a better description, and in some ways kind of then step far enough out of the scene to where they could kind of shout over to them. Notice, I'm trying to find a spot of work since we're running out of time. But notice verse 8. Then said Abishai to David, God hath delivered thine enemy into thine hand this day. Now therefore let me, what? Let me do it. You talk about opportunity. David's got an opportunity now where he's resisted, right? He's resisted to be the one who puts his hands upon the king. So his servant says, okay, I get it. You're a man of character. You're good through and through. Your heart is great in relationship to God. That's not me. Right? Let me do it. I'll take, and it will be done with him for both of us. I'll do it. And let me smite him. I prayed, he's begging him. With the spear even to the earth at once. I will not smite him the second time. And David said to Abishai, destroy him not. For who can stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? Abishai, I appreciate what you're saying here, but I'm not going to be party. There's guilt here either way. And you won't be guiltless because that's the Lord's anointed. David said furthermore, verse 10, as the Lord liveth, the Lord shall smite him. Or his day shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should stretch forth mine hand against the Lord's anointed. But I pray thee, take thou now the spear that is at his bolster and the cruse of water, and let us go. And again, similar to the cave, they're going to take a symbol with them so that Saul knows how close they were and how much danger Saul in some ways would have been. And I still think through all of this that David is hopeful that when Saul sees how many opportunities have come and gone and David has done the right thing, that ultimately Saul will do what? He'll relent and start doing the right things. And sometimes we do the right things. Even when opportunities present themselves for us to not do the right things. And to follow the logic of others. And to be tempted to behave in certain ways. And we have choices to make. And our hope may be that if I keep doing the right things, and I keep behaving myself right, and I keep doing that which is good, and I stay the course of doing these things as God would have me to, that I hope that at some point that'll wear off on others, that others will begin to appreciate that, and maybe they will turn. Did Saul ever turn? In fact, which of those things that David listed actually finally happened? Battle, right? David says, I'm not going to take matters in my own hand. And I would hope maybe that Saul would turn from this and he'd see that I could have killed him in that cave. And I stayed on the other side of the mountain to avoid the conflict. And I can shout out over it, and I've got your spear and your cruse of water, Saul. That's how close I was. But even if Saul doesn't change, is David going to change? No. And that's the lesson for us. Opportunity comes and comes. And we're striving to do what's right. We're living by character. And we're not compromising what God's standard is. We're doing the best we can to do what's right. And it may never be requited. Those that we're doing good towards may still be ill towards us. It may never return to me in the fashion that I would pray and hope for. But at the end of the day, I need to be like David and maintain what is right and good, irregardless of whether it has the outcome that I was looking for. And irregardless of whether it changes the mind and thought processes of others. That's the challenge, I think, of seeing opportunities but maintaining character in the midst of them. We didn't get to that last question of sometimes we can pass up opportunities to do good. And certainly that's a valuable lesson as well. All right. Lord willing, we'll come back, get into lesson 12 on Sunday morning.